All right. Well, welcome everybody to Productionalizing DBT projects on Snowflake. I'm really excited about this session. My name is Jeremiah Hansen, and I'm on our field CTO team here at Snowflake, leading our data engineering workload. I have used DBT for a lot of years and really like the tool, and I'm excited now that this is natively running in Snowflake. So we're going to have a good time today. Quick agenda. It's a simple agenda for today. I'm going to say a couple words of introduction. Then we're going to spend the bulk of our time going through the life cycle of a DBT project, and particularly on the operation side. So how do you actually deploy them and monitor DBT projects? And then we'll end with a brief discussion about the roadmap for this new feature. So let's just jump right in here on the introduction. If you attended one of my sessions before, you know I like to start with a data engineering kind of high-level overview. And I like to always break down data engineering into three phases: ingestion, transformation, and consumption. I think this is just a very helpful framework. When it comes to ingesting data, our goal is to get data from sources into a raw zone. And for that, for data ingestion, we have an exciting new feature, OpenFlow in Snowflake, that lets you connect to those sources and ingest the data. The second phase is transformation, and this is where DBT Projects fits. So DBT Projects is a data transformation tool. It doesn't ingest data. It lives in this data transformation phase. And we'll talk briefly about workspaces as well. And then the third phase is data consumption, which I won't go into detail on that today. So we're really going to spend our time on the transformation part today. I'm not going to, with DBT and DBT Core, I'm going to assume for this presentation that folks are familiar with DBT. I'm not going to do an intro to what is DBT Core and all of that. I'm going to assume you have a working knowledge of it. If you don't, feel free to, there's tons of stuff online that can help you get up to speed on DBT. So we're going to assume a working knowledge. What is it we built? DBT Projects is the name of our feature in Snowflake. And at its core, we're actually, starting on the left here, we're running DBT Core inside of a Snowflake warehouse. This is really important. Historically, for customers running DBT Core, you had to execute the tool somewhere, and that would often be in an orchestration tool. Maybe that's Airflow or Prefect or Dagster or one of those tools or other compute environments. So you would have that external to Snowflake running, and then your jobs would run against Snowflake. With this feature, we're actually running DBT Core inside of a Snowflake warehouse. So that's the first thing to note. It's everything in Snowflake, being an enterprise platform, is governed. So these objects in Snowflake now that you deploy have RBAC and have permissions and all of that associated with them. That's just standard operating procedure for Snowflake. We'll talk a little bit about the developer experience, but that's, in terms of self-service, you can create these DBT pipelines all within Snowsight and within Snowflake. And then, like everything, also important is observability with all of our features. And we've integrated this deeply into Snowflake Trail and all of our features that for operationalizing with event tables and all that. And I'll show you some of that action or in action here in a little bit. All right, so this, like I said, we're going to spend the bulk of the time here in the project lifecycle. I'm going to show, as I go through some slides, I'm going to do kind of a mix of slides and demo. You're going to see this little folder icon with the letters DBT in it. And I just want to, here at the beginning, tell you what that stands for. So this folder is going to represent a DBT Core project. It's going to be a folder of files. And again, this is just kind of standard DBT knowledge here, but the folder that makes up a DBT project has a bunch of standard items, has a DBT project config file, have these model folders and test folders and macro folders and all that. So all of that together is going to be represented by this one icon, this folder icon with the letters DBT in it. So as we get into this, that's what that represents. Now I've framed up the presentation here and the life cycle according to kind of a traditional SDLC diagram that you probably have seen before, the infinity logo. And what we're going to do, today, like I said, this is about operations. So we're going to spend our time on kind of the light blue right half of the diagram here. But I'm going to spend a few minutes at the beginning talking about Workspaces and our DBT projects feature in Workspaces. But this really, just to keep this in perspective, this really falls in the code and build side of things. So these features aren't about deploying and operationalizing. They're about building and debugging. So just keep that kind of in your mind as we go through. So that's the coding part. Then we have the ability to, we'll go through how do you actually deploy your DBT project, DBT core projects into Snowflake. And then finally, how do you operate and monitor those? How do you schedule them? How do you monitor the progress? And we're going to go through it. We'll start with the coding, kind of debugging, building section. We'll talk about orchestrating, and then we'll spend the big chunk of the time here on the actual deployment. That's going to be the most kind of, I think, helpful part to deep dive on. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. That's our model for going through this. Okay, code and build. Like I said, this is going to be kind of a quick section, but I wanted to highlight Snowflake Workspaces. This is our new web-based IDE in Snowsight, and it's often easier just to show this. So let me toggle over here. This is Workspaces. So let's make sure I'm zoomed in here correctly. So in your left nav, under projects, Workspaces is now the default. This is now the default instead of worksheets. One of the things that I've been at Snowflake over 6 years now. Pretty much since day one, customers have asked about how do I, with worksheets, my SQL scripts, how do I check them into source control? And the worksheet editor didn't have that capability. What Workspaces is a more advanced IDE for Snowflake in Snowsight that lets you manage a collection of files. So you can see here, I've got folders with files in them. I can do all the standard things. So I can have a SQL script, which I can run like normal. I can look down here at the query history. So you can see the history of my queries. There's a database explorer where I can actually look at the objects in my database. So all that kind of standard query editor tooling is built in. But one of the really important things here is this is built around with the ability to support Git as a backing for this. So instead of these files being managed by Snowflake, when I create a workspace, if you look up at the top here, I can create a new one where Snowflake manages the files or where they come from a Git repo. And that's really important. And so that lets you check in all your files to a Git repo. And additional, besides SQL queries, I can actually edit files like JSON files and YAML files and others. And that's going to be important with DBT projects. So that's really powerful. Additionally, when you have a DBT project, so this is what the editor you'll use for creating SQL queries and all of that. But additionally, for DBT projects, we have additional controls. So for example, this workspace has a DBT projects folder, DBT core folder. And now you can see I've got some controls up top here. So I can actually do things like run DBT directly from the editor. And that will show up here as I'm running. I can open up my models and I can view the SQL here. I can do things like viewing the compiled SQL. So again, I'm not going to go into the details of DBT, but this has the Jinja in it, the templated version, and this is the compiled version. And then I can even do a DAG viewer. So if I look at the DAG here, I can see, and DAG stands for directed acyclic graph, but it's a way to show the relationship between all the models. I can see those relationships here in a visual way, and I can click on a model to open it up in the editor up top here. And then you can see the output when I ran DBT compile, it gives me the output from DBT. So all of this is part of the editing experience. This was going quickly through this part, but I wanted to just show you can edit your DBT projects here in Snowsight. I can check all those changes into source control. So I have a changes tab here where I can push and pull. When I have changes, they'll show up and I can actually commit them to source control and do all of that. So that's important. That's the editing experience. So let me flip back to the slides here. And the last comment I wanted to make, because this is something customers ask all the time, is because you have your files are in a Git repo, you have a choice of your editor. So you can use Snowsight and Workspaces to do your editing, but you can also use your favorite editor, whether that's VS Code or other. And you can have on the team, you can have some folks using VS Code and some using Workspaces. As long as you share the same repository, you can all work together with different editors, just like folks might use different editors on your team today. This is just another editing option. All right, so that's the workspace. That really is that build and code part. But like I mentioned, the focus for today's session is really around productionalizing these DBT projects. So what I want to do now is get into, we're going to start with the operate and monitor part of this and discuss how this gets run and scheduled and observed in Snowflake. So the first thing to point out here as I get into this is in addition to running DBT core inside of Snowflake, we also created a new object type in Snowflake called a DBT Project object. It's a little tongue twister to say. And this object lives inside of a database, inside of a schema, just like a table or a view would. And the DBT Project object you can think about it as a file container. So it's going to contain a set of files, a collection of files, and it's going to contain a history, the versions of those over time. So when you first create the object, you're going to have version 1 of your project. And remember, this is our DBT project, core project, the folder. As I run an alter against this object and add a new version, I'm going to create a new set of files in this object that are have it given a label, a new version number, and I do that over time. So as I deploy updates to this, I'm going to have new versions deployed into this object in Snowflake. Really important to understand that this is actually an object in Snowflake. And let me show you that actually out here in Snowsight. So I'm going to open up in the Explorer here, I'm going to open up Horizon Catalog and the Database Explorer, and I'll open this in a new tab. And if I look here at the Database Explorer, you're going to notice, let's pick the dev schema, for example. Traditional objects that you're familiar with, tables, views, tasks, etc. But now you're going to see a new item here called DBT Projects. And like I said, this is a native object in Snowflake. And so if I was to click on one of these projects, you'll get the overview page. And this overview page, close that for a second, just like you would see an overview with any object, you get some details specific to that. But this is showing this object in Snowflake. It shows how it was created, what SQL command created it. It was create DBT project, and the permissions and all of that. So very important, this is an object in Snowflake. The second thing I want to point out here is if you're familiar with DBT core, there's a document you can run DBT docs, generate, and you can create essentially a static HTML document which has a DAG and the documentation in it. What we've done in Snowflake is we're hosting the documentation, but in a different form. Instead of actually having that old static HTML document somehow in here, we're taking all the information that was there and surfacing it right here in this experience. So you can see here that I've got the graph, so I can look at the graph viewer. I can do that here as well, right? Looking at the object. I can actually, by clicking on this view, I can drill into a particular part within the project. So I might open up a particular model within my project. And then I get details for that model. So I get all the metadata that shows up. I get the lineage. I get the compiled, basically the source code and the compiled version of it. And this is all things that if you're familiar with the DBT docs, you would get there. I can also do things like view the schedules, run it, download the artifacts, etc. So all of this is where that documentation in DBT core lives inside of Snowsight. All right, so that's our object. Let's go back to the slides here for a second. Now, when you execute a DBT project, there's one SQL command you run, DML command, execute DBT project. But there's two flavors to it. So you can execute a DBT project from a workspace, and you can see that first, the top syntax, or you can execute a DBT project object that exists. And either way, it's basically pointing to a collection of files. When you run it with the args attribute, you can pass whatever command line arguments you want to DBT core. And then if you have multiple DBT projects in your workspace, or in your project itself, you can specify which one to use. So these are our two ways to operate. We've already seen when I ran, if we flip back over to here, you can see when I actually ran, remember I ran the DBT compile step earlier. Here was the output, execute DBT project from Workspace, and then it gave all the details, args, compile. So all of that was running it, let me go back, was running it, through the Workspace. And then when we do it through the DBT project, this is how we'll execute it. So that's the important thing to understand in terms of execution. And this is all done through SQL. So that means that any orchestration tool you want to use, you can connect. And that's the next point, is when it comes to orchestration, you have a choice. And this is beyond the scope of this session to really get into how to pick an orchestration tool. There's a lot of factors that go into that. But I want to point out, Snowflake has a native feature called tasks, and that's our native orchestration feature. And then there's lots of third-party tools. I already mentioned these, just previously: Airflow, Prefect, Dagster, and others. So you have an option to pick. I'll just show you here really quick over here what tasks look like. So again, I'm back to my Horizon catalog. I'm going to look at now a task that I'd created. And the task shows the overview page for the task, shows the kind of some of those same attributes, but it also shows the definition. And just to point out here, so again, here's the SQL way to specify it. So you create task, you give it some attributes like warehouse and schedule. The key part here is really what's this as clause. And here I'm specifying that exact command, execute DBT project, test demo project with my arguments. And that's how I schedule it with tasks inside of Snowflake. And this is very easy to see how you would do this if you were using a different third-party orchestration tool. You can just call execute DBT project directly from the tool, like you would running any other SQL command, like calling a stored procedure or whatnot. Okay, so that's the orchestration bit, just quickly touching on the different options. The final piece here under the observability section and monitoring is just to point out the different spots within Snowflake where where the tools and the data exist. So the first is going to be in Snowsight. We have some dashboards, and I'll walk you through these in just a second. We also have the event table. So if you're not familiar with Snowflake event tables, this is something really you should do a little bit of research into and become familiar with. But we've rolled this out now in Snowflake really to all features, are logging telemetry into this event table. And it's all stored in open telemetry format. And we've even updated the DBT core adapter for Snowflake to do its logging into the event table in open telemetry. So this is really powerful. So everything you see in the Snowsight dashboards, all that data is actually coming from the event table, and you can use it with other observability tools, or if you wanted to create custom processes around it, you can. So very important. And then finally, for those DBT users, we have the ability that you can download the DBT artifacts. So as you run DBT, it produces a bunch of artifacts, like the manifest JSON file is a key one, and other logs. And those are actually you can download those programmatically in Snowflake. This gets used often for things like Slim CI or incremental deployments in DBT. And you can actually I'll show you the pipeline in a bit, but you can actually create a process like that by downloading the artifacts. So those are kind of the highlights of what you want to look for. And I'll just show you here in Snowsight where this stuff lives. So over on the left, under transformation, we have the DBT projects dashboard. And this shows across your entire Snowflake account, all of your DBT projects that you have access to. It shows, gives you the kind of visual trend view of how these have been running. I can drill into any one of these. And so let's take this test demo project, for example, and I can drill into that. And now if you notice, I'm back in Horizon catalog on that particular DBT project object. I'm looking at the history here. So now I can get more details. I can drill into a particular execution of this. And see results. So overall results up top here, you can see the text that was run. It was, again, execute DBT project. And then really nice, we actually show the individual model execution time and the status. So you can see kind of where, which models took the longest. That's the overview. We have the standard query profile that you can drill into looking at more details from the profile itself. And then this part is really exciting. And this, again, comes from the event table. So all this data, even though this tool is showing you visually the results, you can query all this data yourself. But this shows us a span view of the execution. And it's similar in that we can see the individual models that ran, plus some additional pieces of it. And again, you can drill down and you can see which model, the orders model, took the longest. I can then further click on a particular event here, and I can see all the detail, more detail about the span itself, attributes of it, span events, logs, etc. So this is very powerful. The Snowsight tooling here is very powerful for monitoring and keeping track of what's happening. And again, all this is available in the event table. So if you want to create alerts in Snowflake, or you have another observability tool, you can query this data, create any kind of process you want around it. All right, let me flip back over. So with that, we've gone through the operate and monitoring section. And now I want to spend the last bit of time here on the release and deployment side of it. So this is kind of the meat, really the meat of the presentation and what you're trying to do here with operationalizing or productionalizing these objects. And I'm going to start, we have to talk about the 4 types of objects in Snowflake that you can use with DBT projects to deploy. And each of these is actually a file container, if you want to think about it that way in Snowflake. So an internal stage, which you're familiar with, a Git repository in Snowflake, if you've used that, that essentially is very much like a stage, but pulling from your Git repo with Git commands on top of it. Then a workspace, which I showed earlier, is a collection of files. And so you can access those files programmatically in your workspace. And another DBT project object is also a file collection. And so you can pull from that. And these become the sources that as you deploy. I've also included, I'm not going to go through it, talk through it, but I've included what the paths look like to access files in each of those 4 objects. The syntax is slightly different. But those are our 4 types of essentially file stages or file collections. And so when you're deploying an object, this part is this is important to understand the mechanics here. There's 2 commands you can run. There's the create DBT project, and then that creates it, if it didn't already exist. If you want to update an existing one, then you run alter DBT project, add version. And in both cases, there's this from clause. And this is really important. The from clause is what specifies the source files that you want to deploy into this object. And that's where those 4 types of sources come up. So I can pick any one of those, and I can create or alter the object, add a new version from one of these sources. And what Snowflake does is actually creates a copy. This is important. All the files that lived in that location, that source location, get copied into a new version in our DBT project object. If you remember, I showed that slide earlier to visually show how that works. So each time you do an alter, you're creating a new copy of those files in the object, and that they live there. That's really important. So if that source were to go away, you have a static deployed version with a version number that you can use in production until you're ready to deploy your new version. So that's very important. All right, now that shows you though how to deploy, from a stage into the object. But the interesting thing here now, if you're going to do this from a CI/CD pipeline, say you're in GitHub Actions, which I'll show you in a second, you actually have to get the files into that source location first. And so there's a few other steps you have to do. And this is where the Snowflake CLI tool comes in. So this is really important. The Snowflake CLI tool is our command line tool for developers that lets you manage these complex objects like DBT projects and others like notebooks and Snowpark, and lets you deploy them programmatically. This is going to be your best friend in a CI/CD pipeline. And so this tool is separate. We have two at the moment. SnowSQL is our previous tool, command line tool. Snowflake CLI is the new one. The Snowflake CLI tool is where you want to focus. And just briefly, I'll point out, you also should familiarize yourself with the project files in the Snowflake CLI. So these are the Snowflake YAML files that define the project. So if you're working with Snowpark, you're going to have a config file that looks and has attributes about Snowpark objects. If you're working with a notebook, you have things about a notebook. So various config files for that. With DBT projects at the moment, there's not a dedicated Snowflake YAML file. The Snowflake CLI tool doesn't need that for the DBT projects. But for all the other types you're going to be using and deploying, you'll need to be aware of that and work with those. So when it comes to deploying a DBT project, you run snow dbt deploy, and it does a bunch of things for you. It creates this local temp directory. It copies all the files into the temp directory. It then creates a temporary stage in Snowflake, copies all the files from that stage or from the local copy into the stage in Snowflake. And then it does those steps we just described where it either creates or alters that object in Snowflake. And I did a visual version of that as well, so you can see for those visual folks, it makes it a little easier. Imagine your CI/CD agent, your GitHub Actions agents running here. You have a copy of your project. It first creates a stage in Snowflake. Then it copies all of those files. So here in this step, before you do the deployment, you're going to want to do things like, if you have dependencies, you can run your dbt deps there, and you can have all those dependent files created. Whatever else you need to do on your build side. But when you run this, it creates a copy of those into the stage, and then it runs what we just discussed earlier. It runs either create DBT project or alter DBT project, which then takes a copy of those files into that final object in the versions. So that's all. That whole process is done for you when you run that Snowflake DBT deploy. And just briefly, I want to show what this looks like in a pipeline. So in GitHub Actions, I'm showing this with GitHub Actions. If you had a different CI/CD tool like Azure DevOps or Jenkins or other, you can do the same thing here very easily. But the idea is I'm going to come in, and this is actually showing two things, showing a deployment pipeline, but also showing our new GitHub Actions Snowflake CLI action. So I'm combining kind of two things here. If we look at the steps, what we're doing is we're checking out our repository. These are kind of standard steps in a pipeline. I'm setting up Python, and then I'm installing the Snowflake CLI by using our new action. So again, this is that Snowflake GitHub Actions Snowflake CLI action. And after that's done, then I can basically, and there's a few other setup steps that I'm not showing here that the documentation covers. But now I can run the Snowflake CLI tool by just doing run, and here's the Snow, so I can do a version check. The deployment, again, Snow dbt deploy into my project object name, whatever you want to call it, the source folder, and then I'm going to override it. And so I'm deploying it, and then you can see I'm also doing a Snow dbt execute. So part of a dbt deployment is often to actually run the new models, and I can do that here, but with a run and a test. So all of this is showing exactly how you do this deployment, and I have this working in GitHub Actions, so you can come in and actually see the deployment here in GitHub Actions, and all those steps that I just showed, you can see it running in action. So here's we can look at the version that was deployed, and then the actual deploying of the object is this is the output from the Snowflake CLI tool. So all of this is in that file I shared, but this is how you would then operationalize that. So hopefully that gives you the building blocks you need to get started on that. All right, and then finally we're going to end with just a brief discussion about the roadmap, and I really just want to highlight a couple things that customers ask about all the time. So the GA features on the left, we covered most of those, but the roadmap items, Fusion is probably the question that comes up the most. And yes, we are going to support Fusion. We announced this at Summit, and that's coming. Supporting multiple versions of DBT core is another request that is coming, and column level lineage also. So a lot of exciting stuff coming on the roadmap, and then a lot of stuff that we're delivering with GA. All right, well, thank you so much for attending. I hope this was helpful. I hope it gave you the building blocks you need to start productionalizing your DBT pipelines. Thank you.